Good evening and welcome all. My name is Roxanne Smith and I'm a curatorial assistant at the Whitney Museum. I'm happy to share that tonight's event is being live captioned in English. You can enable these captions by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen or on the three dots also on the bottom of your screen. Thank you to Kelly Crowley from Sign Nexus for the live captioning. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's edition of Ask a Curator. This program series gives us the chance to hear from Whitney curators about their experiences organizing shows at the museum, and then offers you all the space to ask your own questions about the art, artists, and ideas behind the exhibitions. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel if you would like to rewatch or share. It is my total pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, curator Barbara Haskell, who will be giving us all an inside look at the Dawn of a New Age, early 20th century American modernism, which opened just a few days ago here at the Whitney Museum and will be on view through January 2023. At the Dawn of a New Age showcases art produced between 1900 and 1930 by groundbreaking American modernists, some well known to us now and some largely forgotten. Drawn primarily from the Whitney's permanent collection, the show offers new perspectives on the ways American artists used and innovated upon non-representational styles developed in Europe to articulate their experiences of the modern age. The show's curator and tonight's speaker, Barbara Haskell, is a longtime curator at the Whitney, a distinguished scholar of American art, and author of over 30 publications. She has curated a wide range of celebrated exhibitions here at the Whitney, including Vida Americana, Mexican Muralists, Remake American Art, 1925 to 1945, as well as the museum's recent retrospectives of Grant Wood and Stuart Davis. She's also a wonderful colleague and mentor to me and many of us working at the museum. I'm looking forward to hearing more about their process of working on this utterly beautiful exhibition. I will return later to moderate the Q&A portion of the program. If you'd like to submit a question in the meantime, please do so using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can click on the icon at the bottom of your screen and then type in and send your question. Please feel free to submit your questions during the talk and we'll select a handful of them to answer. Thank you so much again to all of you for joining us, and I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Barbara Haskell.
Thank you so very much. So as Roxanne said, this is a show of a survey of the first American avant-garde. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So it's America's first avant-garde, as Roxanne said, those artists between 1900 and 1930 that channeled the European styles of Fauvism and Cubism into an American-born modernism. It's drawn from the collection. There's 60 works by 48 artists. 19% of them are new acquisitions. And the most amazing statistic is that 45% of the works on view have been in storage at the Whitney from between 30 and 50 years. So bringing them together does indeed extend the understanding that we have of American art by telling a story of the period that goes beyond just the few artists that generally have, whose careers have been documented. You can see from this first opening wall of the exhibition that these artists came of age during a just tumultuous time of change, technological, political, social. There was the women's suffragette movement, Freudian psychology, Einstein's theory of relativity, revolutions in communication, transportation, architecture. It was as if every sphere of life was changing. And the critic Van Wyck Brooks, his claim that Americans were living at the dawn of a new age of mankind provided the inspiration for the title of the show. But he was not alone in describing the era as one in which nothing seemed impossible. So critic Walter Lippmann wrote that the world was never so young as it is today. He said, we have a world bursting with new ideas, new plans, new hopes. Max Eastman, who was the editor of the socialist magazine Masses, echoed that idea, writing that there was a sense of universal revolt and regeneration of the just before dawn of a new age in America. So the artists that you'll see that I'm going to show you tonight really responded to this euphoria over what seemed the unlimited possibilities of the new, of the future, by rejecting realism, as Roxanne said, in favor of styles that express their more subjective, intuitive visions of the world. So the exhibition juxtaposes just well-known, iconic work from the collection, works by Georgia O'Keeffe, Marsden, Hartley, that you see on the screen. These are two examples actually of how artists have encountered modernism. O'Keeffe didn't go to Europe. She studied the works of the theories of Arthur Wesley Dow, the very influential educator who really exhorted artists not to copy nature, but to develop harmonious patterns that express their response, their intuitive response to nature. So she merged that with a kind of Art Deco, Art Nouveau, lyrical calligraphy, if you will, to create these images that you see on the left, where she captures her sense of the rhythms of nature that almost in a bodily sense capture those feelings that we have in the natural world. Hartley, on the other hand, went to Europe. And you can see in this image, he does what a number of American artists do, that he combines styles that in Europe would have been impossible to combine. So you see him creating an image, abstract portrait of a German officer who had been killed at the beginning of World War I. He uses images related to that officer, but combines that, uses the vocabulary of French Cubism combined with the color of Fauvism and the sort of symbolism and brush technique of the German Expressionists. So these are two works that you all are familiar with, as you probably are with Oscar Blomner. He was a 25-year-old architect when he came to America. He very quickly shifted to fine art and became part of Alfred Stieglitz's circle of artists that gathered around the gallerist at the Gallery 291. In this piece, you see Blomner combining architectural forms with more organic forms. This sense of the synthesis of the dualities of oppositions was something that he continued throughout his life. And like Hartley's German officer that I showed you a moment ago, Blomner exhibited his first kind of mature paintings at 291 in 1915, right as the anti-German sentiment created by the war was rising in America. And these works were seen through the biography of Blomner being a German, and they were totally discounted. They were called evil and malevolent, and nothing sold. And that was true of Hartley too, when he exhibited his German officer pictures. Two other works that will be familiar: Stuart Davis's Egg Beater, one of the few works that the Whitney bought early, that in the early days of the Whitney, primarily the focus was on the realists around Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, in Greenwich Village. Stuart Davis was unusual. He had started out as an urban realist, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney continued to support him even as he turned to more abstractions. This is a work that you probably all know, where Stuart Davis looked at an egg beater, a rubber glove, and an electric fan for so long that he began to create. He distilled them into these abstract planes that then he used to create this abstract work. Patrick Henry Bruce. Stuart Davis, I should say, did the work Egg Beater without having gone to Europe. He was influenced by the Armory show that opened in 1913, that in a sense introduced the American public and even to artists to what was going on in Europe. It was astounding, scandalized the public, but it really inspired artists to be able to do anything they wanted. That with the bar set so high for radical ideas, it allowed American artists to experiment very freely. Stuart Davis is one example. Patrick Henry Bruce was in Europe. He would befriended the French painters. He studied with Matisse and Matisse's painting class, and he created a still life that you see out of objects that were in his studio that he presented from different perspectives, these very monumental, bold forms, and creates a sense of tension between the foreground and background space by placing very typically this white bar on the left side of his composition. Two other works that will be known to all of you: Joseph Stella's Nativity and Agnes Pelton's work. These are artists that responded to the industrialization and mechanization of the new environment by turning to more spiritual pursuits. So Joseph Stella came from Italy, had been steeped in Catholicism as a child, rejected that religion, but continued to kind of channel the mysticism and the rituals of Catholicism. Agnes Pelton, who also hadn't gone to Europe when she created this work, was one of those artists who turned to more Eastern philosophies, more spiritual endeavors like theosophy, out of which she developed various symbols that she kind of encountered or came upon in dreams and meditation. The symbols of the journey that she was taking through everyday life into the world of kind of spiritual illumination. And you can see in this piece the white swan floating on the river of life that then can go into the left-hand corner of the picture that represents this sense of spiritual illumination that Pelton encountered in dreams as unity with divinity. There were other works, as Roxanne said, there would be familiar works and unfamiliar works in the exhibition. These are two works that have been in storage for decades, literally decades. So Albert Bloch on the right was a painter from St. Louis who went to Munich to look at the illustrated magazines which proliferated there. And he became very absorbed in the ideas that were prevalent in Munich, and also Kandinsky and Franz Marc when they were starting the Blue Rider, the kind of legendary German expressionist group that was oriented towards spiritual concerns. They saw Bloch's paintings and asked him to join the group. He was the only American member of this very legendary group. He showed with them from 1911 in their debut exhibition throughout the time of their existence through World War I. He came back to America in 1921, and without any support, with no gallery, he ended up having to take a teaching position in Lawrence, Kansas. And from 1921 until its death, was a beloved teacher, but not an exhibiting artist. So this is a piece very famous in Europe, as I say, the only American to exhibit with the Blue Rider, and it has been in storage for 50 years. The work on the left, Carl Newman, is an example of an artist who was influenced to pursue this very Fauvist symbolic composition by fellow artists. So there were a group of artists in Philadelphia who had been in Europe, came back to Philadelphia, that interacted with Carl Newman and really encouraged him to create this picture that is just bursting with a kind of energy and joie de vivre that is very typical of Americans. Two works, young G on the left was a Chinese immigrant who came to San Francisco because his father was a merchant and had convinced the authorities that his U.S. birth certificate had burned in the 1906 fire. And so G came as an American citizen. And throughout his life had this balance between his identity as a Chinese person, a Chinese individual, with modernism. He was asked one time why he didn't paint in a Chinese traditional manner. And he said, because I live in a modern industrial world. So although he adopted very early on the forms of cubism, these planes of color that kind of reverberate along the composition to create this kind of sense of rhythmic energy. His subject matter was Chinatown in this piece. G, this is a work that we have only shown once in the entire time we've had it at the museum, despite G being now considered one of the most, the most recognized and important Chinese artists from the first half of the century. The first one that was recognized in Europe, the first one that showed at the Museum of Modern Art, it was recognized in the US. So this is a wonderful picture to bring out from storage. William Zorach on the right, I think this is a picture that in a way combines a kind of Gauguin, Fauvist, symbolic Arcadian landscape. But I think his story is interesting because, as is many of the artists that I'm showing you now, Zorach was an immigrant, came from Lithuania, and his name was Zorach Gorfinkel. And the authorities apparently in Ellis Island changed his name to Finkelstein. Then when he was in elementary school, his teacher said that Zorach was not a fitting first name and called him William. So he was William Finkelstein, went to Europe and was in a painting class, met a young woman, Marguerite Thompson. They fell in love, came back to the United States, married in December of 1912. and decided to pick as a last name what had been William Finkelstein's first name, Zorach. So they became William and Marguerite Zorach. Two other works that have been in storage for decades. William FitzTaylor on the left was a 60-year-old impressionist painter when the Armory Show opened in New York. And you can see this work, he just immediately combined the cubist structure that he saw in the Armory Show with the impressionist palette that he had worked with previously in a kind of decorative composition that then allowed him to become one of the foremost sort of theorists about interior design. He wrote a book on color harmonies that was used by interior decorators and designers for years. Walter Pock, again, an artist that we haven't seen in a while, creating this wonderful kind of vibrant cubist still life. Two other artists that have been in storage, Wanya Dawson is viewed by many as being the artist who made the first abstraction anywhere. 1912, he made a work before the Armory Show. He had been an architect, and he credited his study of mathematics to the kind of design, this abstract design that you can see in this picture. The work on the right, Charles Duncan, is interesting because he's this fantastic picture. There are only 2 or 3 known examples of his work that anyone has been able to find, and yet he was part of this legendary Alfred Stieglitz 291 circle. He had his first exhibition in 1916, the same show where Alfred Stieglitz introduced O'Keeffe to the world. It was a 3-person show: O'Keeffe, Renee Lafferty, and Charles Duncan. Ben, another artist that was relatively conservative until the Armory Show, and then changed his style to create these kind of cubist symbolist works that you see on the left. E. Cumming, most of you probably know him as a poet, which he was, but from the very beginning of his career, he saw painting and poetry as what he called equal obsessions. He painted during the day and made poetry at night. In the 20s, he pioneered this group of pictures that he called noise or sound paintings. This work, number 13 from 1925, is the culmination of that series. And you can see in this work that the whirling forms, the sounds, the kind of cacophony that he would have experienced in the urban metropolis. He gradually then shifted a little bit more to realism and became less, the work was exhibited less. And over the course of his career, then he became known more as a poet, and painting was seen as a footnote to his poetry career. But he continued to be as committed to painting as to poetry. Then I mentioned that there were a number of new acquisitions, which have really, which have allowed us to begin the process of addressing female artists and artists of color who have not been in the museum collection before. These are 3 fantastic prints by Aaron Douglas, who's considered the sort of leading graphic artist of the Harlem Renaissance. Came to Harlem in 1925 and immediately began to be commissioned to do the covers of the leading African-American journals, Opportunity and The Crisis, and to do the book covers of most of the leading authors of the Harlem Renaissance. This is a work he was commissioned to make right after his arrival in 1925. Eugene O'Neill's one-act play, Emperor Jones, opened on Broadway. It had opened in 1920, an important play in the Black community because it starred the first Black person in a leading role on Broadway. It was revived in 1925 with Paul Robeson in the leading role at that point, kind of an unknown actor. And these 3 images tell the story of this play from the moment when the emperor, who's leading a Caribbean island, ruling it, is told that he's going to be deposed. In the middle, you see him kind of fleeing, and on the right, you see him overcome by kind of the demons of his own invention, which is the end of the play. Henrietta Shore, one fabulous work by a woman who was born in Toronto, studied with the urban realist Robert Henry in New York, who always said she was one of his best students. Then she went to LA in 1912. and became one of the leading kind of modernists in Los Angeles. But it wasn't until 1920 where she introduced this radical style of these very bold, monumental, close-cropped, essentialized images of nature. This is a painting that suggests the kind of budding of life and the beginning of something new, the envelopment of nature by all of us. The color is this fantastically luminous palette, which she's able to get by applying multiple layers of color, so that the paint seems to glow from within the canvas. You can almost feel it from the image that you see here. These are two other new acquisitions. Blanche Lazelle is the foremost woman of what's called the Provincetown painters, that when the war started and American artists couldn't go to Europe, many of them went to Provincetown, which became a summer art colony. Blanche Lazelle went there and encountered a group of women who are also there, not being able to go to Europe. And they developed something called the white line print. They would incise a very deep groove in a wood block and then apply color to the raised areas, kind of one area at a time. And when the resulting print, as you can see here, that where the incisions were, creates a white line in the finished print. Blanche Lazelle was particularly important in the group because of a work like this, where she's using flat planes of color, but with very kind of almost a watercolor technique, so that looking at the print, it looks like a watercolor, this kind of luminous, soft tonalities that she creates in an overall composition. Marguerite Zorak was William Zorak's wife that I mentioned before. She was much more radical than William Zorak. She, after the two of them came back to New York, her work was in the Armory Show. It also was in a 1916 Forum Gallery exhibition, which was the Americans' answer to the Armory Show. The Armory Show had made many Americans feel that somehow American art was provincial and insular, because the work of the Fauvists and the Cubists seemed so much more advanced. By 1916, though, Americans had caught up, and a group of critics got together and presented the show of 17 of the best American modernists. Marguerite Zorak was in that show. She was the only woman in the show. And in this work, you can see her being inspired by Matisse, but working in a much more symbolist, almost Gauguin kind of style. This blue outlines around forms that almost look like cloisonne. The work is on silk and because of that, has this tremendous luminosity that Marguerite Zorak really felt was her calling card in a sense. She always thought that the color, these bold colors that to her expressed her sense of the world and her emotional responses to the world around her. These are two works by Japanese artists. Chara Obada had come to San Francisco, very well versed in sumi ink painting, which was a ink and brush painting, very typical of Japanese work. He always proclaimed the union of East and West, as he called it, even organized a society called the East-West Society, so that the work has this quiet brush quality of the Japanese style, but with the perspective of the West. What he called, his subject matter, he called the great nature, the American great nature. But you have a perspective along with this kind of quality of the brush, which, as I say, is a union of Eastern and Western traditions and aesthetics. And Teizo Kato, the photograph on the right, is also a union of East and West. He was in LA, which was a center for photography. He was part of the Little Tokyo photography community, the pictorialist photography. He took this kind of atmospheric quality and muted tones of pictorial photography, but united with the voids and the kind of emptiness of what he saw as the Japanese, that stillness of mind, emptiness of mind. There was a group in LA, which he was part of, that actually sought to bring together the East and the West. He was a major major part of that group, a real pioneer in photography during that period. And finally, Pamela Coleman Smith. On the right, on the left, you see one of her watercolors from the early years. She was born in London of American parents, spent her childhood in London, New York, and Jamaica. By 1900, she'd begun to do these very symbolist works that whose the linearity resembled obviously Beardsley, who she had encountered in London, but combined it with a symbolist iconography. So in this piece, you can see women kind of coming out of the waters, merging with the waves in this mourning image of pain and despair. She made the works while listening to music. She had the idea that by listening to music, she could repress the rationality and tap into her interior life and liberate her intuitive inner life, her spirituality. She took the works to Alfred Stieglitz Gallery, 291 in New York. And in 1907, January of 1907, he changed the gallery. Up to that point had shown only photography, and he saw her work and immediately put it up on view. It was a sold out show, a tremendous success. He showed her 2 more times, 1908 and 1909. By that time, she got back to London and had joined a secret sect called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And in around 1909, the sect began to split into several groups. And one of the groups was led by a man named Edward Waite, who had an idea that the society had been very involved in studying the Kabbalah and Egyptian texts, working with tarot cards. And Waite had a vision of the order of the tarot cards, which was different from the tarot cards that had preceded him. And he also had an idea about the symbols on the major arcana of the cards. He commissioned Pamela Coleman Smith to design the deck. The deck radically transformed the decks that had preceded them because of the order, and because Pamela Coleman Smith decorated each card with a fully illustrated symbol. That hadn't happened before. Before, the minor arcana had been a symbol or a number, but not a image. So these cards are still in existence. They are the most popular tarot cards in the world today. And we were able to find a vintage set, which is we have in the galleries. And now I'll turn it back to Roxanne, and she can I'll begin to answer your questions.
Thank you, Barbara. That was a wonderful overview of the show. As we now begin the Q&A portion of the program, I'll be sharing some audience submitted questions. Just to start things off, I was thinking I'd ask something that I've been considering, Barbara, which is obviously your show thinks a lot about the influence of Europe on American art at this time and how that influence was recapitulated and fundamentally transformed by American artists. But I'm curious if you could sum up one overarching thing that sets these paintings apart from what was being made in Europe. Is there some kind of defining sensibility that makes them distinctly American to you?
No, thank you for asking that question. First of all, I should say there were several kind of paths where American artists encountered what was happening in Europe, that many artists went to Europe, and unlike earlier centuries, they had direct access to the major artists through the Stein family. So Gertrude and Leo Stein had a salon, a Saturday salon, invited American artists where they encountered not only contemporary art, but the leading practitioners of modernism. But artists who stayed in America also had access. Arthur Wesley Dow was, as an educator I mentioned, was an important teacher for a number of artists, George O'Keeffe, Agnes Pelton, etc. And what the Americans did, most of them created their major work either by not going to Europe and staying here and encountering work in the Armory Show or at Alfred Stieglitz's gallery. Even the artists who were in Europe, most of them came back before they made their major breakthroughs. And from a distance, Americans were able to pull from various strains of what was happening in Europe. That in Europe, the divisions were much stronger between the Cubists and the Fauvists, for example. There was a lot of competition between those two groups, whereas Americans were able to pull everything together. They could take what they wanted from those various styles. And that's one aspect that's different. I think there's also, in a way, a greater sense of exuberance and joy that America really was at this point coming into its own. It was, beginning to be a player on the international stage. And there was a sense in politics and in culture that there was a new beginning. And that is reflected, I think, in the work. There's this ebullience and almost kind of an innocent joy that one feels in the galleries, these bright colors that suggest a kind of embrace and joy of the unlimited freedom that American artists felt.
On a related note to the influence of Europe, one of our audience members asks about which European artists were exhibited at the Armory show that had so much influence over America.
There were two artists that were the most kind of controversial in the show. Matisse, the American public couldn't understand why the use of arbitrary color, painting a nude that was blue or a chair that was red. So he was a kind of pulse point of criticism. And the other was Marcel Duchamp, Nude Descending the Stairway, which introduced kind of a cubist fracturing of form to America. And both of those, both Matisse and the Duchamp, especially that one picture, were just pilloried in the press. And by Teddy Roosevelt saying it would look like an explosion in a factory, ammunition factory, so that but both of those things, Cubism and Fauvism, then became part of the vocabulary that American artists could draw upon.
One of our other audience members here, Kurt, asks about how the World War affected the receptions that these artists encountered. That is something that you were thinking about as the cultural background to this work in the show.
That's actually also a very good question. So in Europe in the 1920s, Europe was devastated by the war, just absolutely destroyed. The war had been fought in Europe, on European territory. The amount of people, men that were dead, cities that were destroyed. America entered the war very late. It wasn't fought in our country. And the number of people that died, Americans who died from the war, was much lower than what was happening in Europe. So the effect of the war really wasn't as powerful here. Europe had to recover emotionally from this destruction, this idea that ideals and the hopes of those countries were just demolished, whereas America was able to sort of move on. In the 1920s, America became an even more dominant country on the international stage. And but I think what began to happen, and one of the reasons some of the artists are more recognized today as opposed to others, is the lack of sustained support, the lack of sustained gallery support. So there was an outburst of collecting right after the Armory show, but it did begin to dissipate in the later 1920s as you got near the Depression. So, and with the Depression, then abstraction was hardly supported at all, except through Alfred Stieglitz, who continued to support his artists both financially and emotionally. And that's one reason why they sustained their careers. That Arthur Dove, for example, one of the artists from the Stieglitz group, said I couldn't have existed as an artist without Stieglitz's support.
And outside, some of our other audience members are asking about the popularity of this work in America at the time. Outside of Stieglitz's gallery, were these other artists finding commercial success, or did they have to look elsewhere for means of support?
No, that's such a good question, because in the first decades, they were supported. There was this tremendous embrace of modernist ideas, and the new and the novel was totally accepted. And the new galleries opened after the Armory show. And these were artists, the artists I've shown you, the artists that people will see in the galleries, that were supported and celebrated during that period. wasn't until the late 20s and then into the Depression that these artists then found themselves without any financial support. And they either turned to realist styles, or some of them, like Albert Bloch, started teaching, or just they dropped out.
And do you feel like these artists, to what extent were they familiar with one another? I mean, there was obviously different scenes happening within New York, whether that be more of a Greenwich Village scene or the Harlem Renaissance. But there's also artists from all over the country that are part of this show. And to what extent did those spheres of influence coexist or overlap?
No, they did. There were overlapping circles, and the art world at that point was very, very small, so that all of the modernists knew each other. They might not have been in the same tight little circles, but these close-knit circles overlapped, so that people did know each other. They went to each other's studios, they went to each other's galleries. It was just a small world at that point, and they did all band together.
Some other audience members, a few of them, including one, Susan, asks, do you think that the modernist era provided greater space for the presence of women artists, as somehow linked to the cultural energy of this time? And I've noticed that other audience members have also been asking about the number of women artists in the show.
Right, there was a tremendous number of women that worked at that moment, and part of it, the women's suffrage movement. There was a sense of women gaining equality in America, and it was a climate in which women did feel support, which then began to ebb with the Depression. But certainly in this early period, there were a lot of women that were having success as being artists. Pamela Coleman Smith, the first artist that non-photographic artist at 291, but Marguerite Zorak in the Armory show. That again and again, you see women getting support during that period.
Getting some other questions about particular artists featured in the show. Janet asks about Aaron Douglas and says, did Aaron Douglas make other woodcuts? I'm more familiar with his paintings in muted layered colors.
Yes, so he did. He started out as a graphic artist. So the early work up till the 1930s were graphics. So he worked in woodcuts, he worked in prints, he did the illustrations for magazines, for book covers, and that was what he was the most known for. It wasn't until the 1930s that he began to make paintings and murals.
Some other artist-specific questions here. Greta asks, did Henrietta Shore know the artist Kay Sage? There seems to be some similarities there.
I don't think they did. That Henrietta Shore was in California, was in Los Angeles. As I say, she went back and forth between New York and LA. And then in 1930 rather, she moved to Carmel, California. And at that point became relatively isolated from the art world. So no, she didn't know Kay Sage.
Getting so many really wonderful questions, actually. Marilyn asks Marilyn asks about color, as does somebody else who says, asks if there was any kind of relationship between the beautiful colors used in the painting, these kind of paintings in this period of work, and certain technological innovations.
No, I don't think so. In terms of new colors that were being introduced, no. But the artists were almost across the board very interested in the idea of color being a carrier of emotion. So many of the artists in the exhibition really saw color and almost linked color to certain emotions. So the idea that formal qualities, not only composition itself, but actual color could create an impact on the viewer was a very popular idea during the artists of this period. And that's one reason why the colors are so bold. There's a kind of sense that this was an expressive tool.
Totally. Sandy asks about the effect of the almost look of pastel in Blanche Lazelle's Four Boats woodcut. And she asks about more of the technique and how that effect was accomplished.
Right. So it was a fascinating technique. It came out of the arts and crafts tradition, the idea of the handmade. So instead of using mechanical presses, which we sort of think of today, any of you who saw the Jasper John show, his prints are set through mechanical presses, four color proofs. What Blanche Lazelle and the artists of the Provincetown printmaking group did, they took one wood block, very much based on the Japanese woodblock prints. In the Japanese tradition, each woodblock was a different color. The Provincetown printmakers, in a way, revolutionized that idea by using one block. So they would take a block of wood, make an incision, incise the design in the print, and then Blanche Lazelle used French watercolors, which gave her work that kind of pastel quality. She would paint one part of the raised area and then press the paper down on the wood block and pat it out with a spoon or her hand to adhere the color to the paper. Then lift the paper and paint another one of the raised areas. So she would do that over and over again until she got the finished print. And she would use that same wood block sometimes for multiple prints, each of them with a different color. So that sometimes the same wood block was used, sometimes she would do it four different prints of the same design, but different color.
It's like so outrageously gorgeous in person.
It's just so luminous, absolutely. And it has kind of a gentle luminosity that is very appealing.
On the subject of printmaking, someone else in our audience has asked about the impact or the role of printmaking in ushering modernism into America. Were many of these artists also working in printmaking in addition to painting?
No, very, very few of them. It really was a period in which artists worked on canvas for the most part. Yeah, very few artists were involved in printmaking. One of the aspects I think that's kind of interesting in the period, and it was from the Alfred Stieglitz group, but it also was the critics of the time embraced the idea and kind of promulgated it, was that abstraction, because it demanded an intuitive response, a kind of a response of pure experience. You couldn't rationally understand the subject the way you could with a realist picture, that it was a way to liberate people's interior life, that there was this sense, some of the artists felt that you could see in the images I showed, that somehow industrialization and mechanization, urbanization was cutting people off from their more spiritual, intuitive side. And that abstraction was really a way to liberate people from the oppressive qualities of rationality and materialism. So it was as if art had a social utility, that art was about liberating the individual, and who therefore then would in turn liberate society. But there was a messianic kind of visionary quality to the work, to the mission.
And do you think that sensibility is evidenced also in the mysticism of artists like Agnes Pelton or Pamela Coleman Smith?
Absolutely. There was this sense that somehow of disquiet about the rise of industrialization and mechanization, what it was doing to people and people's interaction and people's response to their environment, interaction with people and the environment.
I noticed that one of our audience members, James, mentioned, he said, interesting E.E. Cummings and painting. I didn't realize that. Are there any other connections between these painters and other poets? And then another of our audience members asked about any connections between visual art of this period and other forms of art making, literature, music, theater, dance, etc.
Not so much. I mean, Aaron Douglas illustrated a number of books and articles by leading African-American writers. So that sense, there's a connection with literature. the idea of synesthesia. Music was a very important part of the ideology of the period, the notion that music was an art form that communicated emotions without the need of subject matter or narrative. So that widespread embrace of music as the model for abstract art, the notion that you could express emotions without having to rely on subject matter. So in that sense, there was a great connection between music and art. There wasn't so much specific relationships, but the general ideology and embrace of music as a key to how to read an abstract picture, the kind of impact of abstraction. And of course, the person who asked the question about E.E. Cummings, that although he continued to paint and write poetry, his poetry, of course, was very visual, so that the two were not only twin obsessions, but in a sense, they were merged in his poetry as well.
Another question here about Henrietta Shore, which I'm not surprised about because that's such a banger painting, is did Henrietta, this is from Robin, asks, did Henrietta Shore know Edward Weston, George O'Keeffe? Why is she much less well known? Because she lived on the West Coast?
Fantastic. So Henrietta Shore, as I said, kind of had these breakout style in 1920. She had a show in New York in 1923 at exactly the same moment that O'Keeffe had her debut exhibition. And the critics wrote about the two of them at the same time. And actually, a lot of critics preferred Henrietta Shore, but they also interpreted both of the artists in kind of sexual terms. So those were two artists that were very close in terms of what they were doing and how they were being received at that moment. And the question about Edward Weston is very important because in 1927, Edward Weston went to visit Henrietta Shore's studio. And she'd been doing these essentialized flowers and shells. And he saw the work and immediately changed his style. The work that we know of Weston's, the peppers and the shells that came after 1927, in his journals, he actually acknowledged, he said, everything I've done since has been influenced by Henrietta Shore. He was a big proponent of her work. And it was when he moved to Carmel that she then followed him to Carmel. So that they were extremely close. When he fell in love and moved back to LA, she stayed in Carmel, but he was a strong supporter, champion of her work. He took photographs of her work. He wrote essays about it. So yes, that they were very close. And the connection is quite strong visually. You can see her influence on him without a doubt.
Thinking about other artists like Henrietta Shore, who were producing really great work during their time, but maybe have been relatively lost to art history. We've been getting a lot of questions about your process in bringing forward work from our collection that's by lesser known artists. Or as one of our audience members, Joe Ellen asks, why does some work stay in storage so long? Which is a really succinct and nice way of asking that, I think.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think that's one of the things that this show kind of aims to break through, that art history has been so often of this period told through the careers of 5 or 6 artists only. And in reality, what this show illustrates is there was a host of artists during this period that were caught up in this embrace and excitement about the new, making work at the same level of quality as the works that we've known in exhibitions. And that so going into storage and finding this work and finding that they were as celebrated at the time as the artists that we now think of as the giants of American modernism, to bring it out is a wonderful sort of revisiting and rewriting of the history. And I think that the hope is that these artists won't remain hidden for long, that now that they're out in the open, that they've broken free, that the quality of their work is just so evident that they won't ever be forgotten again.
Thinking about other champions of artists during this time, one of our audience members wanted to bring up the impact of Edith. We've been talking a lot about Stieglitz, but also about Edith Halpert and her influence as a gallerist.
Yes, absolutely. So Halpert was an important gallerist for sure. She tended to be less involved with the modernists because she opened the gallery. She kind of overlapped with Stieglitz, but basically her gallery became much more important in the 30s. So this is she kind of took over where Stieglitz left off in a way. And her real impact is after this moment, this first wave of modernism.
We have time for just one or two more questions. Let's see. Jessica asks about the circulation of information during this time, during this era, from the teens to the 30s. What was the equivalent of our TV today? Radio, periodical magazines, newspapers. How did people across the country find out about artwork?
So there was a very dominant, magazine and newspaper culture that newspapers, unlike now, newspapers wrote about art all the time. So every day there was in mainstream magazines, there were articles about art, and people got their information that way. So in magazines, newspapers, much less, not so much radio because painting was a visual activity. But it was very widespread that there was, and actually the other interesting thing is that even in popular culture, that department stores started showing modern art. So right after the Armory show, even Wanamaker's, for example, and department stores all around the country, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, began to show modern art, so that it was much more integrated into everyday life.
I think I'll end on this question from an audience member, Andrea, who says, what an exciting group of works. What was the inspiration or impetus for putting together this exhibition?
That's a very good question, Andreas. So I knew that the show would be opposite the Whitney Biennial, which is, of course, a survey of contemporary art. And it started me thinking about the difference between our century, the 21st century, which is just at its beginning, and the beginning of the 20th century, and realizing that we're living in this very cynical dystopian world right now, where the future doesn't seem positive. It doesn't seem like we have unlimited possibilities for progress. And the beginning of the 20th century was such a different time. And to go back and look at that moment and realize that there was this sense of hope about the new just seems very invigorating.
Thank you. I think that we're nearly out of time.
Well, so I really welcome you all to the Whitney. This is for me, it's a joy to be able to share this work, which is so exciting and so wonderful. And the mixture of the known and the unknown makes for a show that really hasn't been seen before. It really is a new vision of American modernism that I think we haven't, even at the Whitney, understood before. And it's a wonderful testament to our country and to the kind of vitality of the American art world at that moment. So I hope you all come to see it.